we're gonna, obviously it's 4:15 already, so we'll crunch this a little bit, but I have no problem finishing this part by 5 o'clock, especially since we have a slightly smaller group. We can definitely handle getting through these things. So, from now until 5 o'clock, you're going to learn about basics of advanced arguments and understanding which arguments are allowed to be made at each level of debate. And then understanding the resources available to teach advanced arguments as well is an important part of this. So let's go into it. So what we're specifically talking about are arguments that are going to be allowed once students are in high school JV or middle school varsity. And if you are trying to answer the question of when your students can be at that level, the answer is anytime that you feel like they're ready for it, right? We don't have requirements around, putting students into certain divisions at certain times. It's really just based on coach perception of what the student is ready for, and even what the student says in terms of what they say they're ready for. The only thing we do have is mandatory kind of like promotion, which is regards to being allowed or being eligible for awards. So for example, if you're a middle school novice debater and you win all your debates in the first tournament and get a top 10 speaker, we mandatory promote you to middle school JV. However, what that means is not that the debater actually has to go to JV. It just means they're ineligible for future awards in novice, and thus sort of almost always will choose to promote themselves. Or you'll convince them that that's where they should be. The reason why we do this is to have competitive equity between our divisions, and it really relies on everyone else at all the other schools doing the same thing, so that hopefully we have some new students in each division at each tournament, and then we power match them so that the students with better records are facing the other students with better records, and lower more losses are facing students with more losses in other places. So it really balances out pretty well, as long as we all make an honest effort to put students where they ought to be. But students, once they get to high school JV or middle school varsity or debate en español varsity, will be making these arguments. We'll start with disadvantages. Let's see. Three, sorry. Okay, so disadvantage. Basic definition of a disadvantage is an argument about a bad thing that happens because of the plan that is not a direct response to an advantage or harm raised by the affirmative. So the parts of a disadvantage, again, very quickly here, are uniqueness, the status quo before the plan, link, what the plan causes to happen, and impact, what the plan causes is bad. And all three parts are important, right? So debaters will often forget one of these parts, and that may be a reason why they don't win this argument in the debate round. If you can't prove that the disadvantage would have happened anyway, or would not have happened anyway, or that it links is caused by the affirmative, or that it has any sort of impact, then you're not going to win that disadvantage argument with the judge. And it's separate from what we call quote unquote on-case arguments, because you're introducing a new idea that the affirmative has not spoken about in their debate round, right? So let's get into it. All right, so I'll need some audience participation for this. Our affirmative is arguing that right now student morale is low. It's early in the school year, morale is low. And the harms of having low student morale is that students are going to stop coming to school, and they won't learn, and society is going to fall into ruin. It's going to be death and destruction for all. Our plan is to make the school day shorter, and the solvency students will be able to stay more engaged during a shorter school day. That's how we're going to solve this problem. So what I need is people to either say out loud or put in the chat, what are some potential disadvantages to this plan? And we'll discuss whether those things kind of fall into the category of disadvantage or not quite. But what are some disadvantages of the plan of making the school day shorter?
What about something along the lines of students will learn less content and either test scores will drop or they'll be less prepared for college or the workforce.
Yeah, so I like that argument. And it is a disadvantage because it's distinctly caused by the plan. Now, parts of it could be considered an answer to the harms argument, right? So like a harms turn that the plan is causing students to actually not learn. But I generally agree that it would be a disadvantage because students would not learn. But it's not quite the cleanest example of a disadvantage, because a disadvantage should be sort of unrelated to the problem that we're trying to solve. It should be a totally distinct thing from the harms that the affirmative has brought up.
That's helpful. Okay.
Elise, I see your hand up.
What about something like, then parents will have to look for childcare if the school day is shorter?
Sure, yes. So this is totally distinct and is something that is definitely caused by the plan. If the school day is shorter, parents will have to look for childcare. That might cost families a lot of money and be bad for all sorts of reasons. So that is distinct from the harms by the affirmative. So I would say a disadvantage. Yeah. Josiah, go ahead.
It's kind of a thought. Information retention decreases.
Yeah, so information retention is going to decrease. So yeah, that might be similar to the they won't learn argument, but I agree, and it is definitely something that would be caused by the plan to happen. I think one more person, sorry, just joined the main room who ought to be in here. Give me just a second. Oh, Andrew. Andrew, are you in here? Yes, great. Okay. So Andrew, just a heads up, we're talking about arguments that apply to high school junior varsity and middle school varsity.
Okay.
Disadvantage is one of those.
All right. Thanks, Roger. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right. So I think those are some good examples of things that would be bad that are caused by the plan. I think Erica's and Josiah's examples could get into that gray area of, is it really a disadvantage or is it non-case argument? Because it's talking about whether or not the plan is going to really solve, you know, those harms in the way that it says it's going to, right? The fact that it solves for engagement and morale, you know, is not quite what Josiah and Erica were talking about. So in some ways you could consider it a disadvantage because it's talking about learning. I think Elise is the cleanest example of a disadvantage because it's totally off case. It's about a totally separate subject that the affirmative hadn't even touched on yet. That's not to say that the arguments that were made by Josiah and Erica are bad. They're just not exactly off case entirely. And they don't need to be, right? You can run on case arguments and win a debate just by proving the plan is bad. So yeah. Any questions about disadvantages? All right, so I have one more slide on disadvantages. Here we go. So with regards to the BDL cybersecurity case, there's going to be, and you'll hear all about the BDL cybersecurity case in a little bit, and we're going to do a short debate on it later. The plan is for the US federal government to increase its cybersecurity by working with NATO to set up a platform to share cyber intelligence, increase NATO's investment in technology up to like $1 billion, the solvency talks about, and set up joint cybersecurity teams among NATO countries. So our disadvantage in the packet that we give to middle school varsity and high school JV debaters and high school debate en español varsity debaters will be about basically making Russia upset. And the potential for, you know, if Russia gets upset, it could cause all sorts of problems in the US specifically. So a disadvantage would talk about why Russia might not like this plan and what would happen if Russia is upset. And the disadvantage in the packet talks about how Russia might start attacking the US even more frequently, and that could lead to a war with the United States that is not currently likely under the plan. or under the affirmative. The affirmative talks about, current issues with Ukraine and NATO, but it doesn't talk about the likelihood of going to war with Russia. So the disadvantage in this case talks about how the plan, instead of, making cybersecurity better, it might do that, but it might also lead to a war with Russia, which would be much better than any problem that is solved by the affirmative. This will become a little bit more clear when we have a grasp on what the full affirmative argument is, but that's the basic idea of a disadvantage, something worse that is happening because of the plan that is not a direct response to the problems that the plan is hoping to solve. All right. Let's move on to counterplans. So a counterplan will also be in the high school JV/middle school varsity packet, and be available for Debate en Español debaters at the varsity level. So a definition of a counterplan, a basic definition is a different plan to solve harms introduced by the affirmative team. So one of the most important parts of the counterplan is that it directly has to solve the harms brought up by the affirmative, right? The affirmative in any debate is the one introducing the problem and talking about how it could be solved in the real world. The negative side can't just talk about, here are some different problems and here's a different plan to solve those different problems I brought up, because the debate is ultimately about the problems the affirmative has brought up and how to solve them. So a counterplan cannot make or should not make arguments about how, this other thing is a big problem and my plan solves this other thing that's totally unrelated to the affirmative. A judge is not going to vote for that. Instead, the counterplan needs to solve the affirmative harms. The other two important parts of a counterplan are competition, and this is literally why the affirmative plan and the negative plan cannot happen together, how they compete against each other. There needs to be competition between the two ideas, because if the counterplan and the plan can happen together, then there's not really a debate happening at all, right? The affirmative can just get up on their second speech and say, let's do the affirmative plan and the negative counterplan. That'll make the world even better. And the affirmative is going to win that debate every time. So the negative needs to offer a reason why their counterplan can only happen, is exclusive or mutually exclusive from the affirmative plan. And finally, offer some net benefits, some reasons why the counterplan is going to solve the problems better than the affirmative plan. Most affirmative plans should not and do not claim to solve every single problem entirely, right? So a counterplan can explain why it might solve the problems better. It can also explain why it might avoid causing other problems that the affirmative plan causes. So those are most often disadvantages, right? If a counterplan avoids causing a disadvantage that the plan does cause, then the negative would argue the counterplan is better. Go ahead, Elise.
I'm going to ask a question and we'll see if it makes sense.
Mhm.
If the what if the neg explains a worse harm and explains why it's worse?
Mhm.
And then the counter plan is for that, like to combat that harm.
Sure.
But it doesn't necessarily address the AF plan of the other harm.
Yeah, so generally speaking, our high school varsity debaters would be able to make very strong theory arguments about why that should not be allowed, and that would, sometimes even does happen in high school varsity debates. But at any level below that, you're going to want to know that the judges are basically trained to vote for the affirmative if the affirmative plan best solves their harms. If the affirmative makes the world a better place based on the world they have laid out. So even if the negative shows there's a bigger problem out there, like, this year, the first affirmative case talks about cybersecurity and fake news. The negative could say climate change is a much bigger problem, and my counterplan solves for climate change. It's gonna, stop all emissions. But what they haven't effectively done is make any arguments against the affirmative. So if the affirmative is winning that their plan solves their problems, the judges are trained to vote for the affirmative team. Does that answer
That makes
mostly?
sense. Thank
Okay.
you.
So we're going to go to an example, same example as before, but this time with a counterplan. So again, same exact case as before. Student morale is low. Students will stop coming to school, which means they won't learn and society will fall into ruin. And our plan is to make the school day shorter. Students will be able to stay more engaged during a shorter school day. What are some possible counterplans that we could make? So again, in this case, we're conceding to the affirmative that their inherency and harms are true. We are saying your arguments about the status quo, the inherency, and the problems that are being described are true. But there might be a better way to increase morale and make students learn than making the school day shorter. So what is a possible way that we could do that other than making the school day shorter? Sure, Elise, go ahead.
Maybe something like having more like free periods or like events at school, so
Sure.
it's not just kids working all the time.
Yeah, I like that. So if we look at our previous slide here and look at wrong way, our parts of the counterplan, right? You've offered an idea that we're going to increase engagement by adding more engaging things into the school day, whether it's free periods or other sorts of engaging activities and events. So that's a different way to solve the problem. Sounds great. Is there competition, right? Can the affirmative plan of making the school day shorter and Elise's counterplan of adding more activities and enrichment into the school day, can those two things happen at the same time? No, not really, right? It's going to be very difficult to both make the school day shorter and add more activities and enriching, exciting events into the school day. So there is good competition here. And then finally, net benefits. Can we avoid a disadvantage that Elise brought up earlier of parents needing to find more childcare? Yes, the counterplan actually does avoid this disadvantage because it's keeping the school day the same length or maybe even making it longer and just increasing engagement in a different way by adding activities, but it does not create the disadvantage of needing more childcare. So I'd say that's a pretty solid counterplan. What are some other counterplans we could think of in this situation, other than making the school day shorter or making the school day have more activities or free periods? What's another way we could potentially address this harm?
You could potentially develop courses that students are interested on, like do a survey in which the students could promote, like provide topics that they're more interested in and develop elective courses that they can sign up instead of taking geometry, take, I don't know, plumbing because you want to learn how to be a plumber.
I like it. Yeah. So another potential plan would be, we could add more choice into the school day for students and increase morale. And students won't stop coming to school. They will instead learn, which is great. And if we check our other pieces, is there competition? Well, it would be difficult probably to give students more choice and make the school day shorter, right? Because we do have these requirements. It's not maybe impossible. And we could have a debate about whether you could do the plan and the counterplan together, but it's unlikely. And so I think the negative would be able to convince a judge that you can't do both of those things at the same time. And then is there the same kind of net benefit? Do we avoid, for example, the child care disadvantage? Yes, we do, right? Because again, we're not shortening the school day now. So parents aren't going to need to worry more about childcare than they had previously. So yeah, I would say that's another good counter plan. maybe there's more of a debate about how competitive it is with the affirmative plan and whether the two could happen together, but it definitely still has benefits and avoids disadvantages that the affirmative links to. All right, I'm going to pause this there. Any questions about disadvantages or counterplans?
Of those types of arguments, or I mean, I guess for a disadvantage it makes sense to run more than one, but like for a
Mhm.
counter plan, could you also run more than one, or would those like counter each other?
Yeah, so this is a great question about strategy. And so for the simplest answer for high school JV and middle school varsity is that they only actually are going to have one disadvantage and one counter plan in the packet that we give them. Now, for high school varsity, I highly encourage them to run multiple disadvantages in any debate, especially if they're running a counter plan. Giving multiple reasons, multiple bad things that the affirmative team causes that the negative counter plan avoids, the more disadvantages you have that the counter plan avoids, the better. With regards to multiple counter plans, that's where you get a little bit tricky. I would say usually you're not going to want to run multiple counter plans just because you're going to want to spend your time on the negative arguing for one distinct counter plan. You could make it fairly complex, right? You could say our counter plan involves both what Elise and Douglas said, right? We're both going to have more free time in the school day and more electives for students. That could be just a more robust counter plan by combining those two things together. But I wouldn't want to run them as two distinct counter plans because it's going to be hard to focus my arguments for the judge. It's not that it's not allowed, it's just difficult strategically. All right, so what we're going to do now is we'll take just a 3-minute break because we've been working for a little bit. At 4:40, we will start back up and look at research. All right, welcome back. It's 4:40. So I'm gonna give a very brief overview of some high school varsity advanced arguments, just to expose you to the terms if you haven't heard them before. With regards to how to learn more about these arguments, in our coach resources section of the website, there are lessons about these advanced arguments for high school varsity. And I encourage you to check those out. And those are continuing to be added to. And there are also good recordings in a number of different places on YouTube. I think we have a playlist of some of those videos on Boston Debate League YouTube. And then just generally Google searches and debate sites will have even more info on that sort of thing. But those things are, share my screen. All right, so jumping through the stuff that we already looked at. All right, very brief intro to high school varsity arguments. So topicality is the idea that any case brought up by the affirmative team has to fall within the national topic for the year. If you have mostly coached novice and JV debaters in the past, or all middle school, we don't even really look at the resolution nationally, but each year there is a national resolution. This year it is about the US federal government increasing security cooperation with NATO in one or more of the following areas: artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cybersecurity. Any affirmative plan that is introduced this year is supposed to fall within that topic. If it doesn't, the negative can argue that the affirmative is creating a debate that is bad for education and fairness. And really that's the general idea of a topicality debate, that if the affirmative plan is just way outside of the resolution, it creates an unfair debate. Critique is, another term you might have heard. It's generally just an argument about a problematic assumption being made by the other team in the debate. So the affirmative or the negative can run a critique. It's more often a negative argument. But an example here, for example, would be student morale is low. In the affirmative, we've gotten student morale is low, students will stop coming to school, which means they won't learn, society will fall into ruin. Plan is make the school day shorter and students will be able to stay more engaged during a shorter school day. What assumptions are made in this app that are potentially problematic? Well, you could make a critique about overvaluing the US school system as a whole, right? You could say there have been many examples of how the US school system is not the best way to educate our students, and there are all sorts of inherent problems within that. There's capitalism built into the system, which causes some students to have a lot of resources in school and other students not to. There is, just a general racism baked in terms of, segregation among schools. Like, there are many examples of why our school system may not be the best place for students, and by running this affirmative, you are reinforcing those negative assumptions, problematic assumptions. And critiques are a favorite of a lot of Boston Debate League students on the negative, especially because they can be generalized to be applied to a lot of different affirmatives, right? If you feel very strongly about, the nature of the US federal government and the problems that it's caused, for example, you could make a critique about almost any affirmative plan that's run that involves the US federal government. And finally, theory arguments. These are just arguments about why the purpose of debate in general, why a judge should vote for a team. This is on its most basic level, a meta argument about why debate is important and who should win the debate rounds. Now, a lot of times our lower level debaters, novice and JV, might even choose to make these arguments. They might not even know they're making theory arguments, right? If they're saying, Judge, I should win this debate because blah, 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 really they're actually making a theory argument. They're telling the judge about, why they should win the debate round. But theory arguments can get fairly complex as well, right? Maybe the role of the judge is to, vote for the team that used the most evidence, right? Maybe the role of the judge should be to, be the one who best shows an understanding of who will be able to solve the problem in the real world. Maybe the one is the team who's most likely to go cause real world change. Any sort of argument can be made because the rules of debate themselves are debatable. So a theory argument is just talking with the judge about the theory behind debate and, how the debate round should be judged or what should be allowed in the debates. Any quick questions on topicality, critiques, or theory? All right, so again, I know this is a horribly insufficient introduction to those things, but there are plenty of resources out there. All right, oh, I moved the break up, so not another break, sorry. Intro to research. So in our last 14 minutes, we're going to talk about research, and specifically the kind of research that's allowed in high school JV and middle school varsity. So in high school JV and middle school varsity, which have the same rules, debaters can introduce evidence they found themselves from outside sources. Let's check the chat. Yeah. They can introduce outside evidence that they found themselves, right? If you're a middle school novice or JV debater or a high school novice debater, you're allowed to use ideas that you've generated on your own outside of the evidence packet, but you can't bring in a piece of evidence that backs those ideas up. In middle school varsity or high school JV and high school varsity, you can bring in evidence, right? You can bring in outside evidence that you found, whether it's a transcript of a video or an interview or an article that you found online or from a book, right? Any of these things can be brought in as evidence, and we can debate about the strength of evidence and sources, all day. But the idea is that you are allowed to bring in outside evidence that expands what already exists in the packet. So for middle school varsity and high school junior varsity, outside evidence can be brought in if it is related to or answers arguments made in the existing evidence packet, it is properly cited, and it is made available to the opposing team during the debate. So all three of these things have to be true in order for you to bring in outside evidence. All right. Oh yes, thank you for sharing that, Douglas. All right, so let's go on to how do we start getting our debaters to do outside research? Well, you've probably already been looking at outside videos or having them read articles, or they found stuff about this topic on their own anyway. So start with the stuff they've already found, right? If they have outside ideas that they think are true or arguments that they're making, help them find evidence to back up those outside ideas that they already have. So many times the BDL packet is designed to intentionally leave gaps for the debaters to fill in, right? And so many times debaters will fill in these gaps with their own anecdotes, but they're going to be much stronger arguments if those anecdotes become evidence-based, right? Some basic ways to start your debaters doing their own research. Ask them what evidence in the packet is confusing and could be clearer. Let's replace that with something you found. Ask them about gaps or arguments that are not really answered well by your evidence, right? The affirmative makes this great argument about cybersecurity and the negative has no answer to it. Well, in middle school varsity or high school JV, you can find an answer to that and make your own piece of evidence. And then finally, thinking about arguments that students are already making anecdotally, like I said, and backing those up. My experience with cybersecurity and fake news is like, I was on the internet and I read this article about how fake news is a really big problem in schools. Okay, that's a cool story, but if you can find some evidence about it, if you can find an article that talks about that, you can make it into a piece of evidence and it can be a much stronger argument in the debate. You can use the argument in the debate either way. It's just going to be much stronger, backed up by evidence. So in the last 10 minutes, we are going to talk about how you could start to do this with your students. And then we're going to do a very quick example where we actually create a piece of evidence. And my original intention was for this to be about 10 minutes longer. So I would have had you do it yourselves, but in this case, we will do it together. So one resource the BDL has is the cybersecurity case map. And this is a cool case map because it shows in the style of a flow sheet what arguments exist in the junior varsity, high school JV packet, middle school varsity packet, and how they respond to each other. Right, so here are the arguments in the 1AC, the first affirmative speech in the JV, high school JV or middle school varsity packet. Here are all the negative arguments that respond. And then here are some second affirmative arguments, basically all the affirmative evidence that's not in the 1AC, and some direct responses to those arguments as well that are created for the negative. You'll see, because they're aligned horizontally, that there are a lot of arguments that just don't have responses. They're just big gaps here, right? In the 1AC, US cybersecurity is not prepared to stop attacks. The 1NC says Biden is already working with NATO and has been since early 2021. The 2AC does not have a piece of evidence that says, hey, wait a second, actually, that work that they've been doing since 2021 is insufficient. It's not, it's not good enough, right? That might be an argument that people make, but that piece of evidence is not there. So you could go out and find a piece of evidence to respond to that in your debate. What we're going to do is look at this. So where do you see a gap? One place that you might see a gap in this case map is that when we talk about fake news, there are other causes of fake news that are not addressed by the affirmative team. So let's see. Here is an article that talks about other reasons why, or ways in which misinformation was spread during the 2016 election, other than from Russian cyber attacks. If we want to make it into a piece of evidence, what I've done is taken it, I've literally just taken this article, copy and pasted the whole thing into a Google Doc, and we're going to turn it into a piece of evidence. So what I would like everyone to do is I'm going to copy this Google Doc into the chat. And I'll make you all editors. Copy link into the chat. Here we go. All right. So what I would like everyone to do, and there are 7 ways, or actually 8 ways listed in this article. What I want everyone to do is highlight a way in which misinformation was spread during the 2016 election. So just go in and highlight a way that misinformation was spread during the 2016 election. And I put it in the chat so you can all access it that way.
Roger, I'm not sure if you'll address this later,
Yeah.
but I had a quick question, which is, and I can't remember this like from when I did debate, but could a negative argument also like attack the credibility of a source, or is that sort of outside the scope of this?
So absolutely you can. And that can happen at any level of debate. You're allowed to talk about the credibility of the source at any level. And we're going to talk for very briefly, even in the next 6 minutes, about the credibility of this particular source and how the BDL evidence displays the level of credibility of the source on every single page in the evidence packet. All right, we're gonna, I know it's very quick and we're abbreviated here, but take just maybe one more minute to highlight something about a way other than from Russian hacking, fake news impacted the 2016 election.
Roger, what are we looking for now? I'm sorry, I missed it.
Sorry, so this is, we're generally looking for, this is kind of going to be a negative piece of evidence, which we'll talk about why Russian hacking is not the only thing that led to fake news and impacted the 2016 election.
Am I just Googling that or am I using a resource?
So in the chat here, I dropped an article and we're just highlighting a portion of that article.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought we were doing something past that. I did that. Okay.
No, yeah, then that's all. That's all you need to do.
Okay, thanks.
All right. So I'm gonna turn it back over to the piece of evidence here. Let's take a look. Let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. All right, so we're gonna make this into an official piece of evidence that could be used in a BBL debate, and you can take it to your students to use in day one if you'd like to. All right, here we go. All right, so in this article, we're trying to prove something along the lines of, and I'm going to write my own tagline here. Fake news was caused and spread in other ways than the affirmative talks about, not just from Russian hackers. All right, so this is the tagline. I've written this myself, and I'm saying this is the argument I want to make, and I'm now going to prove that that's true with the stuff that I read that's highlighted below. So I'm going to look down below. There are all sorts of things that are highlighted, but for example, there was concentrated fake news ecosystem highly active both during and after the 2016 election, right? So the fact that the election itself was the target of all this hacking is not directly true. It's proven by the thing highlighted. Most of the accounts spreading fake or conspiracy news included in the report show of evidence of automated posting. So again, it wasn't just Russian hacking necessarily, it was automated posting that had part of the problem here. Substantial amounts of misinformation was spread both by Republican and Democratic identified accounts, right? So there were both pro and anti Donald Trump fake news accounts spreading information. So if I'm going to make my argument that all of the information coming from Russia was helping Donald Trump get elected, that's just not true. So there may be other things in this article, but basically to create a piece of evidence, I've written a tagline which makes the claim I want to make from this evidence. I have highlighted some things. This is the same as in the packet bolding and bolded and underlined text in the packet is the same as highlighting something. And then I have a citation. So I'm going to make a quick citation. Here's my source, which was the Knight Foundation. The original article was published by the Knight Foundation in 2018. So I would copy that. I would say, this is from the Knight Foundation in 2018. I put the name of the article, make this really accessible. I put the source of the information, the Knight Foundation. I put the original date of publication, October 4th. And finally, I have my address. And so the reason I include all of these things here is just because I want to be able to prove where this information came from. This is a real source, right? And anyone can know that this is a real source because they can click right on this link, see that all this information I've put here is true, okay? Now, this is not enough to display the credibility. The BDL goes one step beyond this and lists the credibility or background of the author or publication in every single page in our packet. So I'm going to flip over to our packet very quickly. Can you all see our packet now on the screen? All right, great. So you'll notice each page in the packet has the author, but then the first thing in the citation to Allison's question.
Wait, sorry, I
is-
think you're still displaying your Chrome window.
Yep. All right, let me redisplay here. So you'll see the author is on our card. The very first thing that we put in the citation is the credentials of that author. So for example, who are Marks and Schaefer? Well, Joseph Marks writes the Washington Post cybersecurity newsletter focused on policy and politics of cybersecurity. Aaron Schaefer is a technology and cybersecurity policy research for those other publications. Our next piece of evidence says Andy Greenberg is a senior writer for Wired, covering security, privacy, and information freedom. Jane Mayer has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1995 and is the magazine's chief Washington correspondent covering politics, culture, and national security. So every single piece of BDL evidence is going to have some credential for the author. Now, that's not to say that it's always a good source. You can always challenge that a source might be biased or that an expert is not really the best expert out there. Your piece of evidence might have a better expert. But every piece of BDL evidence will have at least some information on who the author is. And we encourage you to have your debaters follow that same template of including at least a little information about the debater if they create their own piece of evidence, about the author. Yeah, any questions on research before we go back to the main group? All right, so again, we're building out our curriculum and lesson plans available to coaches. So there will be a lesson on how to start your debaters with getting engaged in research that you can do at some point with them during the year as well, once you think they're ready for it. So with that, I'm going to close the breakout rooms and we'll head back to the main session. Thanks all.